In this video, you're going to make the head. This is going to be quite a long video. We're going to start by sewing it together, and the video will go all the way through until you attach it to the body. The head has 3 parts to sew together, the 2 sides and then the gusset, and you should have marked on there where the eyes will go, and you may also have marked where the ears will go. I'm going to start by sewing from the neck up to the nose, just sewing the front and back together. Now the gusset's sewn on, I'm just marking the middle. And we're starting from the tip of the nose and from that middle marking and sewing all the way down one side, and then repeating that, sewing all the way down the other. This is another time when you could use lots and lots of pins, but sometimes it's easier just to hold the 2 pieces of fabric together and sew slowly and stop and adjust a lot. Whenever you stop, make sure you leave your needle down so that you don't move the position of your fabric under the needle. I'm sewing very, very slowly around this area. I've left this part of the video at the actual speed so that you can see how slowly I'm sewing it and how often I stop to readjust the fabric. And the point of the gusset ends right down the bottom, but I'm not sewing quite to the end. I'm stopping with just enough space for the other side to sew on as well. And then I'm starting from the nose of the other side, which is a bit awkward because I have to sew it on the other side of the presser foot. And I did speed that one up. So both the sides are sewn on. I just check from the other side to make sure I haven't gone too close anywhere, and I'm touching up, doing a second line of stitching anywhere I might be a bit close to the edge, and then I'm clipping the curves and the head sewn together. So now I'm sewing around the ears. There's a lot of spare fluff to remove from the ears. Leave the bottoms open. And the second ear. That video's sped up. Snip and turn. There's a bit here where I am close to the edge, but it's not quite as important because there's no stuffing in the ears, so there's no pressure on the seams. There wasn't a hole though. Now I'm going to sew the ears on next. You can start to see this bear's personality. It's got a very pointed nose, this one, which is quite different from other bears that I've made. I usually make bears with a bit of a flatter face. So I've got the points marked already from the pattern where the ears go, and I'm sticking to what the pattern tells me for the moment, even though it's not really where I would normally put them. These ears are fairly far on the side, whereas I would normally put the ears a bit further to the top. But the first time I make a bear from a pattern, I like to follow exactly what the pattern directions are, and then I can make any adjustments. So I'm using pins so that I can mark the location on the outside to see them. And then I need to just line up the ears with the 2 pins. And I'm just having a look now to see if I like how they look. I decided I didn't like the shape of the ears because they go out a lot on one side, so I'm just showing you I've resewn one of the seams there to change the shape a little bit. And so that's something that you can do as you're making your bear. If there's something you don't like about the shape, there are some things that you can change as you go. It would be a lot more difficult to change the shape of the nose at this stage if you wanted to shorten it, but you would do that on the pattern before you make the bear a second time if you decided to change the shape of the head. But things like the shape of the ears are very easy to change. So I'm just folding the edges under and hand stitching them closed using a ladder stitch. I'm not being particularly neat because nobody will ever see these stitches apart from you. But so for a ladder stitch, you go in on one side and then straight across and under on the other side, so that every time you cross, it's like the rungs of a ladder, and those ladder rungs are the only bits you see, and when you pull them tightly, they pretty much disappear altogether. It's a good idea to practice that stitch now because that's what you'll be using to close up all of the gaps in the arms and the legs and the back later on. So if you can practice your stitches now, then they'll be neater later. You don't actually have to sew this folded under before you sew the ear on. I just thought it would be easier and one less thing to worry about while I'm sewing the ear into position, because it's a little awkward holding it and sewing it at the same time. Now the way that I sew the ear on is I sew across the front and then across the back, aiming to mostly sew the front of the ear when I'm going across the front and the back of the ear when I'm going across the back. And I'm just doing a whip stitch. And I pretty much lie the ear, push the ear back almost flat so that I can see where I'm stitching each time round. And you can always go around it a second time if you decide your stitches are too big or too far apart. And there I just pulled out some of the hair to cover my stitches a little bit more. if you can get strong thread that's the correct colour to match your fur, it's easier to keep your stitches hidden. But once you pull out some of the fur from the seams, it really does hide almost everything. I just used my finger and a pin to do that. Okay, sewing on the other ear now, doing exactly the same thing, sewing the bottom bit in first of all using a ladder stitch, and then sewing it onto the head around the front and around the back. I like to do plenty of knots on the ends of the ears because that's where they get most pressure. Those ears are very sideways, and I'm looking at the bear now and thinking it's a bit of a funny bear face. I would put the ears further up normally and have a shorter nose, but anyway, I'm going to go ahead and do the eyes. So I just put the pins in first again to have a look at it and see what I think. Check that the positioning's all correct. Fold it in half to check that it's symmetrical, and then make a couple of holes with the awl. When I'm making the holes for the joints later, and for the eyes now, what I'm trying to do as much as possible is push the threads apart rather than breaking them. So unfortunately you can't see the eye very well, but I just pushed the little glass eye through the hole from the front, and when it comes through, there's a plastic bit that you put on the back. Once you've got the plastic bit on, it's really hard to take off and change. So I put both of the eyes in first of all and have a good look at it and make sure I'm happy with it. Because although I don't really want to have to make a second hole to move an eye, I'd rather do that now than be unhappy with the position later. So I put both the eyes in, have a little look at it, and once I'm happy with them, I stick those little plastic backings on. Okay, here's a bit of a funny looking bear, perhaps more like, I don't know what he's more like. But very long nose, big ears, funny eyes. Okay, I'm going to sew the nose on now, and I'm just going to use embroidery thread, black embroidery thread, and I'm not going to separate out the strands at all. So it's the usual 6-strand embroidery thread. It's looking a bit dark now. The shadows must have come over. I start off by marking the area that I'm planning on making the nose with the thread and then filling it in. The other thing I've done is I've used some scissors and just trimmed away some of the long hair from around the nose, just from where I'm putting the threads. A lot of people give the whole nose area a bit of a haircut, and it actually looks like a different fabric sewn on the nose sometimes, but I don't often do that, and I like to wait until the end to see whether I think that it needs that anyway. So for now I've just trimmed the hair that's in the way of my stitches to make it easier to sew and to cover them. And I've just gone back and forth until I'm happy with it, and I've sewn a little mouth, but he's looking pretty grumpy and his chin's jutting out a bit. So his personality is starting to show here. Now I need to sew a thread just by hand stitch around the neck. I'm going to use a strong thread. It doesn't need to be particularly small stitches, but this is to gather it in after I stuff it, because our next step is to stuff the head. So I'm just doing a running stitch around here. I have tied a knot on the end of the thread, but I'm also leaving a little end there so that it's easy to hold and give it a little tug afterwards to gather it in. We've sewn around that, and now we're going to stuff it. You need to stuff jointed bears very firmly, and although I'm just using normal polyester fibre fill here, you could use a cotton or a wool and make a very firm bear, but I quite like the polyester because you can stuff it very, very full, but it still has a bit of squishiness. It would probably, if it was a real heirloom bear, if I was hoping it would become a family heirloom, I would consider using a different type of fill. So you just keep shoving in that fibre fill until it's very full, until you cannot fit anymore. And now we're going to put the joint in. We need 2 of these wooden circles, and I'm just gathering everything. A split pin, 2 of the larger size washers and 1 tiny one. I'm opening the split pin just a tiny bit. I don't really want it open, but I have to put this first washer on. Then we just put a really tiny washer on the bottom, and that just helps to make sure that the split pin doesn't pull right through. And then we're putting the slightly larger washer on, and then we put it through the wooden circle. Okay, all of the joints are going to start this way. This one goes into the head. And now we need to gather that fur fabric in around the joint, and we need to try to keep the joint flat, because if it's if it goes crooked as you're gathering this in, then the head sits on an angle. And actually I did often put the heads on at a slight angle on purpose, because they tend to look nice and inquisitive that way, but it's pretty hard to put it on completely straight, so try to get it straight. Now, my first thread, when I was pulling it tight, actually ended up breaking, so I've used a stronger thread, in case you notice it's a different colour now, and I've sewn it double thickness around. And when I'm pulling it here, I haven't pulled it quite as tight, and I've tied it off. And now I'm just going to go around and around with stitches, pulling them tight in smaller groups and knotting as I go in case it breaks again. We need to keep pulling this in, gathering this in, until it's completely closed up around that split pin. So I'm sewing about 1/4 of the way around, and then I'll pull it tight and do a few stitches to knot it, and then I'll continue round. So you can see eventually I get it very tight. You can't see any of the stuffing, and then I do lots of knotting to finish it off and go right across a few times. We want this very, very secure. Lots of knots there. When I'm confident that it's tight, I snip it off. The head attaches to the top of the body, pretty much where all those 4 seams meet. And so I use the awl to push a hole, and actually I push it slightly off the seam, because I don't want to break my sewing threads. And then we push the split pin through, and then we do the other side of the joint. Make sure it's straight. Make sure the head's facing the front of the tummy. We put another wooden circle on, and then we put one of the larger size washers on that, and then grab the pliers, the long nose pliers, and we need to twist and pull each of the arms of the split pin out and sort of curl them round so that they push hard against the wooden joint and so that they're pulled apart. And the idea is that we want to do this quite hard so that the head doesn't turn easily. It will loosen over time, so you want it to start being very firmly attached, or it will all just become floppy and come apart. And I've got that firmly attached, so we've done the head and we have attached it onto the body.